I added Nissan to F1 and simulated 10 seasons in F1 23 and the results were very unexpected. Season 1 starts off with a very dominant win for Max as Red Bull also won the Constructors. Ferrari were ahead of Mercedes, who were pretty much a one-man team with Lewis in the car, and Nissan also had a good first season, getting 29 points through Nakajima. We didn't know who else to use, so why not a pretty forgettable mid-noughties Japanese driver. Onto the driver moves, and this is why Mercedes finished so low. At mid-season, Russell was replaced by Liam Lawson, who went on to score 27 points in 8 races. Mercedes really shot themselves in the foot with that one. But at postseason there wasn't much change, but Fernando did call it quits as Sargent went to Aston Martin and Pourchaire went to Williams. For season 2 there's aero and chassis regulation changes, and in the performance graph it's pretty close, but Nissan are the second worst team. Do not worry though, if you watch the Audi video, this team won't turn out the same way. Season 2 now, and Hamilton got his 8th title as once again he was a one-man team at Mercedes. He carried them to 301 of their 330 points as once again Lawson was absolutely useless. Red Bull were the team who got the Constructors win as Max and Perez could both actually get points, and it was a pretty close title fight as they were separated by 7 points. Nissan fell to 10th in the Constructors with 0 points as only AlphaTauri were worse. Into the driver market, and this time there were more moves. Tsunoda and Iwasa did a seat swap, and Sainz and De Vries also seat swapped. Hamilton was dropped after his title win and didn't retire, which is pretty insane, and Albon replaced him at Mercedes as Zhou went to Williams. Lawson replaced Zhou at Alfa Romeo, and Drugovich joined Mercedes in place of Lawson. And finally, Sargent was dropped by Aston Martin and replaced by Russell. There were no brake changes for season 3, and the graph shows the same very close grid as Haas are somehow 5th best and Nissan dead last. In season 3, it's a sight we're used to seeing. Max claimed a dominant title win as Red Bull had nearly double Aston Martin's points. Talking about them, they went toe-to-toe with Ferrari as they were severely held back by Nick De Vries, scoring just 35 points as Leclerc carried the Scuderia. Russell also majorly carried Aston Martin as it was pretty much a 1v1 with Charles and George. Alpine also claimed a lot of points as they were not that far off from Mercedes, and Nissan got 0 points as 3 teams failed to score. Mid-season now, and Drugovich was dropped by Mercedes after getting 51 points, and so they replaced him with Sargent, who went on to get 9 points in the final 8 races. What is it with Mercedes and making terrible decisions? Iwasa was also dropped and replaced by Hauger at AlphaTauri at mid-season, and at post-season Sargent was shockingly dropped and replaced by Hauger. Deruvla went to AlphaTauri and Hulkenberg retired, leading to Sato moving to Haas. Perez was dropped by Red Bull and replaced by Pourchaire, who was in turn replaced by Doohan at Williams. For season 4 there was powertrain and durability regulation changes, and Nissan aren't far off moving back into the midfield as Mercedes have slipped down to the levels of McLaren and Alpine, with Aston, Ferrari and Red Bull still out in front. In season 4 we got another Max domination as he got 350 points and 11 wins with 15 podiums. Mercedes were back up to second as Hauger and Albon were a good pairing, and Charles' great performances were once again held back by 49 point and Nick De Vries, as Russell also massively carried Aston Martin as Stroll got 16 points. And Nissan are getting back up there as they finished in 5th with a very equal driver pairing, who both scored podiums and were separated by 8 points. We once again have clear backmarker teams forming as 4 teams failed to score. Feels just like 2010. On to driver moves, and at mid-season there was one change as Doohan was dropped and replaced by Iwasa at Williams. At post-season, Tsunoda was dropped by Nissan and replaced by Bottas, and Iwasa moved to the empty seat at Alfa Romeo, and Doohan rejoined Williams. Zhou was dropped by Williams and Piastri moved there, as Deruvla went to McLaren and Sargent joined AlphaTauri. Stroll was shockingly dropped and Marcus Armstrong was his replacement, and finally Ocon was dropped and Drugovich moved to Alpine. There were no reg changes, and Nissan have now moved up to the top 4 on the grid as Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes and Nissan are all at the top. Aston Martin are not far behind, but then the rest of the teams are pretty close to the bottom, which includes McLaren and Alpine. For season 5, Max won again with 9 wins and 13 podiums. Charles put up a good fight in that Ferrari as De Vries scored 90 points, but ultimately the Mercedes pairing was very consistent as both drivers scored over 200 points. Nissan stayed near the top as there is an insane gap in between the teams. After Nissan's 216 points, Aston Martin are next with 45, which just shows this. Nakajima cracked the 100-point mark as Bottas scored 57 points in 8 races before being replaced by Kalen Williams, who bettered him by 1 point. Onto that as well, the only other change in mid-season was Sargent, who was dropped by AlphaTauri and replaced by Vips. At post-season, Sainz was dropped by AlphaTauri and replaced by Ocon, Drogovic was dropped and replaced by Vips at Alpine, and finally Novalak moved to AlphaTauri. There are big reg changes as aero, chassis and powertrain are all affected, and in the performance graph we can see the gaps. The top 4 are miles above Aston Martin, who are sat in the middle, and the other 6 teams are all very close at the bottom. In Season 6 we had a different winner as Max was nowhere to be seen. He was even beaten by his teammate. Leclerc was finally rewarded for his great performances so far in this save, and Nick de Vries was also really good as Ferrari's trust in him paid off as he got 170 points and his first 2 wins in F1. On the left I've put the points that each team scored as we don't have a screenshot for that table because Aki forgot. As you can see, Nissan have fallen off big time. Not really too sure why, but the performance graph shows the massive drop off, and clearly the reg changes have affected them. With these changes, Williams are now the 4th best car and Mercedes are stuck in a midfield battle. Into the driver market and at mid-season, Sato was dropped and replaced by Vesti at Haas, and Doohan was dropped again by Williams in favour of Fittipaldi. At Red Bull, Verstappen retired and was replaced by Lance Stroll, and elsewhere Vips was dropped by Alpine and academy driver Doohan finally got a chance in the Alpine. De Vries was dropped after his best season and replaced by Drogovic, as Hauger was dropped by Mercedes even after outscoring Albon, and he was replaced by Kalen Williams. His seat at Williams was taken by Sainz as Fittipaldi was dropped by Williams for Marino Sato. That is not confusing at all. In Season 7 we had an insane title fight as Drogovic, Leclerc and George Russell were scrapping it out, and they were separated by only 4 points at the checkered flag in Las Vegas. Russell won that race, but even with Leclerc and Drogovic finishing outside of the podium, they were still just ahead. A truly insane title race. Wins were pretty evenly spread out as the top 3 in the championship claimed every win available. Elsewhere, Sainz got 44 points as Nissan bounced back to 8th, and the midfield is very close. On to driver moves, and at mid-season, Stroll was dropped after scoring 7 points and replaced by Hauger, who went on to get 74. Kalen Williams was also dropped by Mercedes and replaced by Fittipaldi, and at post-season, Iwasa was dropped and replaced by Kalen Williams. Drogovic was also dropped by Ferrari and replaced by Yuri Vips. What is it with Ferrari and firing drivers after having good seasons? Vesti was dropped and replaced by Caldwell at Haas, and Hauger was replaced by de Ruvela as the academy driver got the drive at Red Bull. Jake Hughes moved to McLaren and Sato was dropped as Cordial moved to Williams. Albon and Fittipaldi were dropped by Mercedes as an all-Dutch lineup of De Vries and Verschoor joined them. And finally, Sainz was dropped by Nissan in order to bring the king of overtaking, Kamui Kobayashi, to the Japanese team. No reg changes, but as you can see, Nissan have recovered from the initial reg change woes and are now the 3rd best team. Otherwise, apart from Mercedes being a midfield team, nothing is unusual. On to Season 8, and Nissan are world champions. 2 consistent drivers was the catalyst for this, as Ferrari's one-man team of Leclerc claimed the driver's title as they were punished for dropping Drogovic. Despite Vips getting a win in a Ferrari 1-2, he was not good enough in their eyes. Pourchaire also carried Red Bull as de Ruvela was uninspiring as they finished 3rd. Kobayashi was at his best as he and Nakajima cracked 200 points each and were 3rd and 4th in the championship. They both claimed their first wins in the sport as well and also got a 1-2 in Singapore, and Nakajima a win from 22nd on the grid in Canada. The gap is now bigger than ever between the front and the back of the grid as Aston Martin in 5th with 174 points were followed by Alfa Romeo with 8 points in 6th. Into the driver market, and at mid-season Vips was dropped and replaced by Sargent, who managed nearly half of Vips' points total as Ferrari were back to the days where they could only manage one driver well. Cordial was also dropped and replaced by the GOAT Nissany at Williams. Jake Hughes was dropped as Novalak moved to McLaren. Boschung replaced him at AlphaTauri, and finally Doohan was dropped by Alpine for Enzo Fittipaldi. At post-season, Williams was dropped and Verschoor went to Alfa Romeo. Sato moved to Mercedes as Norris was dropped and replaced by Doohan at McLaren. Calderon went to Alpine as Magnussen retired and he was replaced by Drogovic. Armstrong was dropped and replaced by Boschung at Aston Martin, and Nissany moved to AlphaTauri. Mikhalski, who was a reserve driver, moved to Williams, and finally Sargent was dropped by Ferrari for Vesti. There are chassis and powertrain regulation changes, and Nissan are now level with Red Bull as the gap in the grid is now bigger than ever. In Season 9, Leclerc claimed another title as Ferrari were very good. Despite dropping Vesti at mid-season with 112 points, his replacement got 107, and Aston Martin were also spearheaded by Russell's 269 points. Leclerc was too good though, as he got 8 wins and 12 podiums to win Ferrari another Constructors' Trophy. Nissan were not as good, but Kobayashi once again was 3rd in the drivers as Nakajima was not as good, although he did get a win at Singapore. Red Bull have also fallen off as their one-man team in Pourchaire was held back massively by de Reuveler, who wasn't even good enough to make the top 10. On to driver moves, and obviously I've already mentioned the Ferrari moves, but Boschung was also dropped by Aston Martin and he was replaced by Vips, as Sato was dropped as Mercedes went back in for Kalen Williams. At post-season, Verschoor was dropped and replaced by Cordial at Alfa Romeo, Gasly was dropped by Alpine and replaced by Sonoda, and Piastri was dropped and replaced by Calderon at Williams. Schiffer, another reserve driver, joined Alpine as Russell was dropped by Aston Martin for Marcus Armstrong. Leclerc was also dropped by Ferrari for Marino Sato, and Williams was dropped by Mercedes for Jake Hughes. Iwasa went to Williams to replace Mikhalski, and Kobayashi retired, which allowed 100 rated Lando Norris to join the team for the final season. With the teams being level at the top, but the other teams having weaker lineups, this was the perfect storm for Nissan and Lando to capitalise on. And my god, did this perfect storm happen. Lando claimed one of the most dominant title wins I've ever seen, as he got 13 wins out of 16 and finished in second in the other 3 races. He got 0 DNFs as teammate Nakajima was slacking and got 4 DNFs, 0 wins and only 3 podiums. His only challenger was Pourchaire and he was over 100 points behind. This truly was an insane season, as Nissan also won the Constructors unsurprisingly. But what a way to end the simulation, as McLaren are probably regretting ever letting him leave, as they got 8 points. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out my other simulations and also subscribe for a lot more. Like the video to help it out. Thanks so much for watching, and goodbye.